Good morning. The title of my paper is Frankenstein's Deadly Sins. Do you remember going to bed as a child? Perhaps you had heard some scary story recently. Imagine you crawl into your bed. You shuffle yourself into a nice, comfortable position. Your parents tuck you in and give you a kiss on the head. They tell you goodnight, and on the way out, they turn off the lights and close the door. The room is dark, but slightly visible. Your eyes begin to feel heavy. They begin dropping slowly until they are shut. All of a sudden, you hear a strange noise coming from what seems to be your closet. Your eyes burst open. Immediately, you grab your stuffed animal and sit up in the corner of your bed, farthest from the closet, holding up a blanket in one hand while squeezing Mr. Cuddles in the other. You both pop your eyes just above the blanket. You give a desperate and innocent whisper saying, "Who's there?" You wait a second or two, and the door slowly opens. It groans with a great squeal. Your heart cannot bear this fear of that which lurks within your closet, and you scream for your parents' help. They rush through the door and turn on the lights. You say, "There is a monster in my closet." They open the closet, and there is no monster, but a hanger that fell and a door hinge that has not been oiled in a while. We, like children, often mistake the place where the monsters dwell. Real monsters do not hide in our closets or under our beds. Rather, they roam in plain sight, usually right under our noses. Should we not know who the monsters are and where they lurk? As in life, so in books. We want to know who is the protagonist and who is the antagonist, who is the hero and who is the monster. So who is the real monster in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? We may think that the word monster is a fitting name for the creation because of his grotesque face and disproportionate body. But we never think about the terror that created the monster, Victor Frankenstein. It is not his outer looks that make him a monster, but rather his sins that are his monstrosity. In order to understand this book, one must know that Frankenstein is not the literal monster, but the one who makes him. Nor is Frankenstein's creation a green giant with bolts on his head who can barely speak English. The story of Victor begins with the birth of his fascination and devotion to discovering the secret of life. Upon acquiring the knowledge of how to do so, he makes haste to begin this new project. After countless of hours of assembling body parts from a variety of creatures, the creation finally awakes and rises before his creator. However, Victor becomes overcome by fear and panic that he cowers before his own creation. The next day, he is again greeted by the face of the monster. Frightened, he abandons the monster, and the two go their separate ways. In the span of months, the monster ventures across the world, eventually learning how to read and write on his own. Because of the constant attacks, insults, and injustice that he bears, he develops a misguided perception of the world and of the people in it, almost as if he was in a different world himself. The monster could only perceive the world through a glass, gazing upon those who experience love and beauty and all the other joys of the world, but not being able to do so himself. As he realizes that this blissful reality was just a more depressing fantasy for him, he breaks, and rage festers inside to the point where he decides to take revenge. He goes on a killing spree, taking the life of one person to the next, killing all beloved to Frankenstein. At this point, Victor's blood boils at the very thought of the monster. His source of happiness becomes dependent on his success in murdering his creation. This wild hunt for vengeance forms a great illness within Frankenstein that haunts him to his grave. Ultimately, Victor dies from that illness, and the monster, laying by his dead corpse in remorse for his sins, repents and promises to take his life as well. What would have been the commencement and climax of Victor's career turned into the beginning of a long and torturous journey for both characters. The downfalls of Frankenstein that make him the true villain of the story are his ignorance, isolation, and pride. I start with ignorance because it was ignorance that started it all. When he was still in his youth, He failed to heed his father's instructions concerning the knowledge and progression of science. As Thomas Stanford says, Victor rejects the prudential warning his father gives him about reading the works of Cornelius Agrippa. Instead, the 13-year-old youth follows his own fatal craving for forbidden knowledge. Having cut himself adrift from his father's guidance in his studies, Victor's desires drive him further into alchemy, even as he goes to college at Ingolstadt. Victor, being filled with the excitement of knowledge, was too oblivious to foresee their causing the events to follow. What could go wrong with making a giant, hideous monster? Had he just contemplated the dangers that would occur, he certainly could have had a good turning of the wheel of fortune. But his ignorance does not cease there. When encountering the monster again and listening to his tragic story, Victor does not realize how mistreated his creation was, or at least he did not understand to the full extent. Instead, Frankenstein only sees the outside, giving his own detailed description of the monster's appearance, saying his yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries underneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuries only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. Do we not fall into the same ignorance as Victor? Today we are frightened by the thought of going out in public without makeup or gelled hair or whatever kind of fashion we are inclined to. Imagine having to bear the torments of the monster as a result of your natural outer appearance. Though we can imagine the same burden upon us, it is unlikely that any of us have undergone an experience of the same degree. Still, are we not to pity the monster? For he did not ask to be brought into this world, especially with such a horrible appearance. It was Victor who forced him into that unkind world. However, when the monster pleads to Frankenstein, saying, "Everywhere I see bliss, from which I am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall be virtuous again." What does he do but respond with harsh words, saying, "Be gone, I will not hear you." And what does Victor do to aid his friends and family? Why, he cries and complains and wallows in self-pity, playing the victim, even though all the events are rooted from his own sin. He is in many cases too ignorant to change his fortune and the fortunes of the one he supposedly loved. But there is little love from Frankenstein. Frankenstein's love rotted as he spent much of his time in solitude. His isolation from others during his schooling was the beginning of a decline in his health. When he worked continually to perfect his craft, he had no one to admire his work, nor did he have anyone to correct his mistakes. As new thoughts and ideas grew in his mind, what could he do but let them marinate until he could further develop them on his own? For he had no one to challenge his way of thinking or to shape his mind. He had no one to comfort him in times of need. He was alone. This kind of attribute developed deficiency in his character. His creation reflects the same deficiencies caused by loneliness. It is only when Victor becomes ill that his friend Henry Clerval accompanies him and comforts him. "Excellent friend," he says, "how sincerely did you love me and endeavor to elevate my mind until it was on a level with your own. A selfish pursuit had cramped and narrowed me until your gentleness and affection warmed and opened my senses." Frankenstein's most virtuous state occurs when near his friend. This is the benefit of friendship that we get to experience on a daily basis. This is the kind of nourishment the monster never had, who was frowned upon by his father for being similar to him. Had the monster been granted his wish for a companion, a being who was as monstrous and tortured as himself, a being whom he could love and could in return love him, both characters could have benefited. The monster too could have undergone a virtuous transformation if only he had a friend like Henry. When the monster slays Victor's friends, Victor lives in solitude, devoting his time and plans to murdering his mistake. At this time, Victor's mental and physical health deteriorates as he gets more tired of the seemingly everlasting hunt. Victor then comes to mirror the monster, who is the physical manifestation of Frankenstein's sin. Frankenstein's final and arguably worst sin is his prideful nature, which can be said is the root of all sin. We see his sin blind him from the warnings of his father. Victor's pride carries the idea that he is justified to recreate man, that he is justified to play God. But this endeavor to create new life would be the end of his life and of others too. Due to his pride, Victor fails to understand who is responsible for his bad fortune, as if he did nothing to deserve all that has happened. He blames fortune and the monster for the consequences. And when the question, who created the monster to be the cause of such a fate, occurs, he acknowledges his doing, but passes over the guilt. Because Frankenstein is too prideful to admit his error, he cannot find the power to forgive the monster for murdering his friends and family, instead allowing anger to control his passions and decisions. Victor's pride is responsible for him taking justice into his own hands as he contemplates how to murder the monster. And his pride not only neglects his past crimes, but also tries to justify them in any future ones as well. It should be understood that my intentions of accusing Frankenstein are not attempts to justify the monster's sins, as if he is an innocent child. For as the Bible says, even a child is known for their deeds. Though the monster was abandoned at birth and self-raised, his crimes cannot be justified because he inherently knew that his actions were morally unjust. But the monster's crimes were not left unhaunted by his conscience. The monster explains his pain to Robert Walton by saying, "My heart was fashioned to be susceptible of love and sympathy. And when wrenched by misery to vice and hatred, it did not endure the violence of change without torture, such as you cannot even imagine." Frankenstein's suffering is just a sliver of the suffering that the monster bared. The monster was not born to be a murderer. His existence was not to lead to Victor's death and the death of others. But when seeing Victor spoil himself in aspects of the world where he was eternally exiled from, vengeance took control over him. Naturally, this enticement to sin became too strong to the monster and possessed him, making the monster take all that Frankenstein loved as a means to show an eye for an eye. Frankenstein's neglect and refusal to take responsibility had thus made the monster out of his monster. However, the same goes for both characters, as both are slaves to their emotions. Neither are able to restrain their desires. In the end, that lack of restraint costed both. This is the result of pride. No good comes from it. But the monster had the power to repent for his sins. Victor, on the other hand, could not let his pride go even on his deathbed. Victor found no fault in his actions and ultimately never solved any of his problems. The monster took blame for his actions, repented, and found a solution to ease his pain and to prevent hurting others again. The monster was not fully man, but in the span of his short life, he became more of a man than Frankenstein, and Frankenstein became more of a man than that creation which he called a monster. The sins of Victor Frankenstein were seemingly harmless, if not even noticed by himself. If these sins have been the fault of fantasy characters, surely the same effect has had its toll in the real world. Do not be ignorant of your neighbor or their wise counsel. Have a keen ear to that which is true and good. Do not isolate yourself from others, nor let others isolate themselves from you. Be a blessing to them, and let them be a blessing to you. Do not be prideful, for with pride comes a downfall. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. Do not be the next Victor Frankenstein, lest you plague this world with another monster. Stray from his ways and be like Christ, who is neither ignorant, secluded, or prideful. Go out and be like him. Love God and love your neighbor. Thank you.